Support for Anderson Cooper 360 comes from our friends at Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans. Home plays a big role in your life. That's why Quicken Loans created Rocket Mortgage. It lets you apply simply and understand the entire mortgage process fully, so you can be confident you're getting the right mortgage for you. To get started, go to rocketmortgage.com/AC360.
Good evening. There's breaking news tonight on many fronts, whether it's the wildfires in Southern California, new polling on the president, new Russia revelations, and this, yet another lawmaker, this time Republican Congressman Trent Franks of Arizona, stepping down as the House Ethics Committee launches a probe into possible sexual harassment. It is happening just hours after Democratic Senator Al Franken announced his resignation. There's also, of course, Democrat John Conyers stepping down in recent days. And, of course, Alabama GOP Senate candidate Roy Moore and his accusers, with a special election there now 5 days away. Now, if all this feels like what the accuser of yet another congressman, Republican Blake Farenthold, calls a reckoning, it's hard to argue. But it does raise the question, a reckoning for whom? In his resignation speech to the Senate today, which critics have noticed did not admit to any wrongdoing, Senator Al Franken called attention to what he seems to see as a double standard.
I am leaving while a man who has bragged on tape about his history of sexual assault sits in the Oval Office, and a man who has repeatedly preyed on young girls campaigns for the Senate.
More. Senator Franken spoke today after at least 32 Democratic senators called for his departure. And whatever you think of the senator's contrition or lack of it, or any of the facts of the complaints against him, he raises a point we'll be talking about tonight, which carries a fair share of weight given the upcoming Alabama election. Are Republicans turning a blind eye to their potential Senate colleague and the President of the United States? Today, White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders said the voters have already decided about the president, though we've got some new polling showing his popularity at an all-time low. As for Roy Moore, listen.
We've seen Democrats forcefully call for John Conyers' resignation, Al Franken's resignation, which happened today. Do Republicans and does this president risk losing their moral authority on this issue, which is a huge issue right now, by endorsing a candidate like Roy Moore, which has now been backed by the RNC as well?
Look, I've addressed this in depth. We think that the allegations are troubling and that ultimately this is something that the people of Alabama should decide. Steve?
Why not call for him to drop out of the race or a writing candidate?
Steve.
Was the
Sarah, is the president failing to lead at this
Hey,
critical
Kristen,
moment?
I'm going to move around here.
Yeah.
So the president endorses Moore. He'll be speaking tomorrow in Pensacola, Florida. And while it's not being billed as a campaign rally, Pensacola TV is seen by plenty of Alabamians. And, of course, the Republican National Committee is endorsing Moore by pumping dollars into his campaign. As first, as you know, the RNC suspended their support for Moore when the allegations of sexual assault first came to light. But they got back behind Moore soon after the president got off the sidelines and endorsed him. Since that happened Monday night, we've been asking someone from the RNC to come on the program. They've declined each day, so we sent Randy Kay to see if she could get them to talk. And she joins us now from Washington. So did they talk?
They did, Anderson, eventually. We were trying to track down here in Washington Ronna McDaniel, who is the chair of the RNC, and we tried several locations. She is a tough woman to nail down. So we finally caught up with her in front of the office for the RNC. And I can tell you that she right away said that they could only answer one question, that she was short on time. She had flown in from Michigan early this morning to have a meeting with the president at the White House. We don't know what was said at that meeting. So we were told, once again, short on time, only one question. Well, of course, as you can imagine, we had a whole lot more than just one question for her. But this is how the conversation went. So when it comes to what's happening in Alabama, who do you believe? Do you believe Roy Moore, or do you believe the women who have come out of this?
Well, we've said all along that these allegations are incredibly disturbing, that if they were proven true, that the candidate would be unfit to serve in office. But it's up to the voters of Alabama right now. This is democracy. They're going to see this play out. They get to make that decision. It's not up to me. And the president has said we want to keep the seat Republican. The RNC is the political arm of the White House, and we want to support the president's agenda.
Can I just follow up, because we didn't really get an answer on what you believe or who you believe?
It's not up to me. It's up to the voters of Alabama. Ultimately, they're going to have to make that decision next Tuesday. This is something that's getting a lot of media. They're going to have to go into that voting booth and make a decision as to who's best to represent them.
Is that why the RNC decided to support Roy Moore again, is in finding his way?
This is democracy. The president has indicated he wants to keep this seat Republican, and we're going to we're the political arm of the White House, so we're going to make sure that the president's able to accomplish this turnaround. Thank you so much.
And once again, Anderson, now Ronna McDaniel has said that the Alabama voters are going to be the judge and jury of Roy Moore. She didn't really expand on that today. And one other thing we noticed that she didn't mention today is the candidate's name. In that conversation, she referred to Roy Moore as the candidate. She never actually said his name, which we thought was interesting. We were also able to confirm just how much funding the RNC, the National RNC, has sent to Roy Moore and his campaign. 2 payments, one of $50,000, Anderson, and one of $120,000. So a total of $170,000 from the RNC, Anderson.
All right, Randy Kaye, thanks for that. 3 views now from Stuart Stevens, also Amanda Carpenter and Ed Martin. Stuart, have the Republicans lost the moral high ground on sexual assault and harassment to the Democrats? Do you think President Trump's 32% approval rating is any kind of a reflection of that?
Well, there was a lot of hope that when Donald Trump was elected president that he would change, he would grow into the office, and he would evolve. But his support of Roy Moore would indicate that that's just not happening on this level. In many ways, Donald Trump was a gateway drug to Roy Moore. He never effectively dealt with accusations against him. And if that's acceptable with Republicans enough to elect him, what's the logical thing that you end up with Roy Moore, who is accused of being a child predator?
Amanda, I know you think the Democrats are putting forward a very public zero-tolerance approach to this issue. How would you label the Republican Party's approach?
Well, the Republican Party approach, listen, if moral high ground won elections, Donald Trump wouldn't be president. This alone is not going to do it for the Democrats. That said, this is about energizing and motivating that hardcore Democratic base of Democratic women who are upset and angry over sexual abuse and harassment issues. So I think this is pretty smart. But, I don't see a lot of reaction from Republicans. Their point of view at this point is like, well, if Al Franken doesn't think he's fit for office, then go ahead and resign. If anyone else doesn't think they're fit for office, go ahead and resign. But Donald Trump will never say that.
So, Stuart, is the message then just deny everything and then just keep moving forward? Because that seems
think about it. Is that what kind of message does that send to our kids? Is that what teachers teach students to do? Is that what coaches teach their athletes to do? They just deny everything, and that word will make it okay. It's the exact opposite of that. I really don't see this as a political issue. I see it as a civil society and a decency issue. The fabric of civil society is held together by very thin and fragile threads. And one of them is decency, and one of them is rule of law. And in the case of Roy Moore, you have someone by every standard has violated the decency standard. He's admitted to trying to date 16-year-old girls in his 30s. That's a creepy thing. People say, well, it's just Alabama. Listen, I grew up in Mississippi, and every father I knew, if he saw a guy like Roy Moore in his 30s trying to date a 16-year-old daughter, they would have had a date with a baseball bat. And this idea that somehow that Roy Moore is an outsider. Roy Moore's been running for office or holding office since 1982. He's a professional politician.
These issues never came up.
Listen, I can tell you why it never came up. I did the campaign when Governor Riley ran against Roy Moore, and we beat him 2-1. The reason this didn't come up is because Roy Moore was out there saying such crazy stuff that you didn't need to look into his background.
That doesn't pass
that
the
is
smell
the case
test,
now. It's why he lost. It's why he lost 2-1.
Right. Roy Moore was twice removed as Chief Justice in Alabama. The second time, basically the court in Alabama, a number of judges unanimously believed that he was being misleading, not credible, and essentially lying.
Well,
so if his credibility has already been questioned by sitting Alabama justices, which I don't really think are representatives of like a left-wing fringe, does that not raise any questions for you about his credibility?
Look, but we have lots of candidates that have credibility issues, right? We have lots of people that have lied. John McCain won re-election a number of times after he said he made a mistake in the savings and loan. Look, if you want to get to the point of it, this is very important. Roy Moore has run for decades on a position in terms of judges that I agree with. And if that's your fight, yes, he got thrown out by other judges who didn't like his position, but that's a fight we're going to have.
Violating state and federal regulations.
But that was regulated by the same people he was disagreeing with, and he was reelected. The people of Alabama get a right to have
and then he was tossed out again because he was misleading. He had told probate justices in Alabama not to obey a Supreme Court ruling.
But Anderson, you and I both know that was a substantive disagreement. They may have said that they didn't agree with it, but
being
he was making a
misleading,
point.
manipulative, and filing, sort of basically misleading on your own position, essentially lying. That's not just a difference on beliefs. That's what's right and what's wrong.
I guess if the debate is about.
Sorry, go ahead, Stuart.
Go ahead, Stuart.
Can I just raise one other point about Roy Moore? Lost in all this sort of pyrotechnical stuff about the sexual allegations and the fact that he was tossed off the bench twice. Roy Moore absolutely does not believe in the Constitution because he believes in a religious test to hold office. Now, that is specifically prohibited by the Constitution. He has said that a Muslim should not hold office in Congress. That's a fact, Ed. He said that. And now, there are a lot of people that agree with him. I understand that. But it is not what the United States Constitution says very explicitly.
Yeah, Ed, do you think it's appropriate? Do you think a Muslim should be able to hold office?
Sure, of course I do. And if that's his position, I never heard him say it. But look, Stuart,
elections. But wait a minute, Ed, how can you say you never heard him say it? He's on record saying that. He's on record saying that the only thing the Islamic faith has ever contributed to the United States is 9/11. He's on record saying that Keith Ellison should not be able to put his hand on a Quran to swear in to Congress. That Muslims shouldn't be in Capitol Hill.
Well, I don't think I knew all those quotes, but I'll just say this. That's why we have elections. And if the people of Alabama reject that, are you saying that we get to vet who gets to run for office? We can all say over and over, we don't like Roy Moore, just like I can say over and over, I didn't like Ted Kennedy or I don't like whoever. But people get to vote on this. And it's nothing in our Constitution says that you can't run for office and have views that other people
you can be a bigot
with.
and you can get elected to Congress.
Right.
It's just a question of whether you admit the person is a bigot or not.
Well, but my job in talking about this, what was brought up is whether you're saying the Republican Party has a zero tolerance on sexual harassment or whatever the question was earlier. And what I'm saying is you guys think that it's okay to pile on 6 weeks before an election, Stuart, and claim that you know this guy's heart and the truth about him. And I'm saying let's go to the election. And if you want to have an ethics committee hearing and put up members of the public accusing members in the Senate of conduct, giddy up. Let's line up all the members.
This is not the highest use of the U.S. Senate. The second worst thing about the Alabama election, aside from all the history that Roy Moore has, is the fact that all his statements and crazy thoughts have not seen the light of day because he did say those things. And even worse, he refuses to show his face and answer questions about that. Instead, he has this embarrassing spokeswoman who's on the air last night who doesn't have any remote idea of how to answer these questions. Roy Moore believes this stuff. And if you believe it, brother, get on TV and make your case. Because I think people should hear it now so that we know what's coming. Because next it's going to be on the floor of the U.S. Senate. We
got to leave it there. Stuart Stevens, Amanda Carpenter, Ed Martin, thank you very much.
Thanks, Anderson.
Much more ahead tonight on Roy Moore's views, including a newly uncovered statement from Moore on the campaign trail saying that even though slavery was wrong, the last time America was great was when African Americans were slaves. Later, more breaking news. These are live pictures of the wildfires now consuming Southern California. Or actually, these are just in, I should say, not live. The situation is evolving with every shift in the powerful winds. We'll have an update from the scene ahead.
Support for Anderson Cooper 360 comes from our friends at Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans. Chances are you're confident when it comes to your work, your hobbies, and your life. Rocket Mortgage gives you that same level of confidence when it comes to buying a home or refinancing your existing home loan. Rocket Mortgage is simple, allowing you to fully understand all the details and be confident you're getting the right mortgage for you. To get started, go to rocketmortgage.com/AC360. Equal housing lender, licensed in all 50 states, NMLSconsumeraccess.org number 3030. Remember, to create an ad like this one, visit purewinning.com/CNN.
With 5 days to go until the special Senate election in Alabama and the race between Democrat Doug Jones and Republican Roy Moore very close in the polls, what is still unknown is how Alabamians will react in the voting booth to the claims of sexual abuse and, in one case, alleged sexual assault against Mr. Moore. As you saw at the top of the program, the Republican National Committee is backing Moore with a new infusion of cash. The president, of course, is all in as well, and the overriding theme for many top Republicans is that this is up to the people of Alabama to decide. We had Mr. Moore's spokeswoman, Janet Porter, on the program last night. I asked her about the allegations made by a number of women, which Mr. Moore and others have attributed to a conspiracy involving a whole bunch of different groups at different times, including at one time or another the Washington Post, what they call the lynch mob media, George Soros, the DNC, Mitch McConnell, mainstream Republicans, radical homosexuals, transgender groups, and criminals. They've also offered really no evidence directly to back up those claims, but much of the focus of my interview last night was other statements that Roy Moore has made over the years, all public statements on the record. He hasn't repeated some of them in a while, so I thought it would make sense to ask his spokeswoman if Mr. Moore still stands by those statements. These weren't trick questions. Moore's on the record, as I said, on all of this, and as you'll see in just a moment. But first, though, I do want to play some of the key moments from my interview with Janet Porter last night. We did edit it for time while trying to preserve the context. The whole thing is online. You can see. Take a look. Does Judge Moore still believe that homosexual conduct should be illegal and that homosexuality is still the same thing as bestiality?
Well, I think that what Judge Roy Moore, and I can't answer that question, but what I can answer
because that's what he said in the past.
I don't have that answer, but I can tell you what he does believe regarding that issue. And regarding that issue, if you want to talk about making sure we don't have sexual predators.
Does he still believe that 9/11 may have happened because, quote, we've distanced ourselves from God? Because that's what he said in the past. Does he still believe that?
You know, this is the thing, that when a lot of people talk about God and how they're Christians. In fact, if you look at the commercials of Roy Moore's opponent, he's telling everybody what a great Christian he is and how he defends the Second Amendment.
You don't know the answer about 9/11.
The fact of the matter is, I don't know the answer to 9/11.
Okay.
No, I'm sorry, I don't have that answer.
Does he still believe an American citizen who's a Muslim should not be able to serve in Congress?
I think that what he's getting at there is that we believe in the rule of law by the Constitution, not Sharia law. And I think that's really the bottom line of what we're looking at.
Right. He said that Keith Ellison should not be allowed to use the Quran. I am sworn to uphold the Constitution, and he'll lose his job if he has to stand for that Constitution. So you don't know the answer to that
stand for
either.
Religious liberty.
Does he still believe that Keith Ellison shouldn't be allowed to swear on the Quran?
If you want a guy that's for women's rights, Anderson, if you want somebody who's for women's rights, then
I get you don't want to answer these questions. Does he still believe that the U.S. has become the focus of evil in the world because the U.S. promotes things, in his words, like same-sex marriage?
You know, you can ridicule biblical beliefs if you want.
I'm
There's
just wondering
no
if does he
newsflash
still believe
there,
the U.S.
and
is
the
the
people
focus
of
of evil in
Alabama
the modern
do too.
world? Because that's a pretty bold statement.
He has stood for the Constitution, and that's really what it's all about.
We're certainly hoping she gets back to us with answers on those, just to clarify his positions. Just in order, the questions were, does Roy Moore still believe homosexual conduct, meaning gay and lesbian people loving each other and expressing that love, should be illegal? And does he still equate homosexuality to bestiality? The other question was, does he still believe 9/11 may have happened because we have distanced ourselves from God, as he said in the past? Does he still believe an American who's a Muslim should not be allowed to serve in Congress or swear an oath on the Quran? And does he still believe this country has become a focus of evil in the world because of things like marriage equality, all of which he said in the past? Now, keeping him honest, from those answers last night, we don't know. But just in case you think the questions themselves were somehow beyond the pale or made up, I just want to show you Roy Moore's exact statements on all of those items in order. First, here he is on tape equating homosexuality to bestiality, as well as him suggesting 9/11 was the fault of Americans.
Because it's done behind closed doors, it can still be prohibited by state law. Do you know that bestiality, the relationship between man and beast, is prohibited in every state?
Because you despise this word and trust in perverseness and oppression, stay thereon. Therefore this iniquity shall be to you as a breach ready to fall, dwelling out in a high wall, whose breaking cometh suddenly at an instant. Sounds a little bit like the Pentagon, whose breaking came suddenly at an instant.
Those are the first two items. About Muslims, he has said, quote, the only thing I know Islam has contributed to America's 9/11, and said to WorldNet Daily about Congressman Keith Ellison taking the oath on a Quran, quote, in 1943, we never have allowed a member of Congress to take their oath on Mein Kampf or someone in the 1950s to swear allegiance to the Communist Manifesto. Congress has the authority and should act to prohibit Ellison from taking the congressional oath today. Finally, he used an old President Ronald Reagan quote about the Soviet Union to compare it to America today. That is on tape.
He said that Russia was the focus of evil in the modern world.
You could say that very well about America, couldn't you?
Do you think?
Well, we promote a lot of bad things, you know.
Like?
Same-sex marriage.
That's the very argument that Vladimir Putin makes.
Well, then maybe Putin is right. Maybe he's more kin to me than I know.
Roy Moore's views over the years. And again, when asked about them, whether he still stands by all those statements, his spokeswoman either wouldn't or couldn't say if he stands by them. And as you heard, she mainly shifted the subject. Now, CNN's K-Files uncovered an additional statement from Mr. Moore's past.
We have kids driving by shooting each other that they don't even know each other. They're acting like animals because we've taught them they come from animals.
That's from 1997, and at a rally back in September in Florence, Alabama, when asked by an African-American about the last time he thought the country was great, he hearkened back to the days of slavery. Here's the quote, as reported in the Los Angeles Times, Vox, and elsewhere. Quote, "I think it was great at the time when families were united. Even though we had slavery, they cared for one another." He added, "Our families were strong. Our country had a direction." These are just some of Roy Moore's beliefs, not shy about stating them, which makes it so puzzling that his spokeswoman cannot. Lots to talk about. Joining us now is Bill Britt. He's editor-in-chief of the Alabama Political Reporter. He has an interview coming out Sunday with Mr. Moore. Bill, I'm wondering, does Roy Moore on the campaign trail repeat some of the things he has said in the past? Because it seems like his spokesperson doesn't really want to talk about them or was unaware of some of them. And I'm wondering, are they still in his sort of stump speech at all, or are these just random things he has said over the years that he doesn't continue to talk about?
Anderson, thank you for having me on. You know, here in the South, we generally, we will take our crazy people down and put them in the parlor or put them on the front porch. We rarely put them on television. And look, Roy Moore is a very polarizing figure. I couldn't speak for what Roy Moore does. Does he say things that are outrageous to most of us? Absolutely. But there are people in Alabama, and I would dare say in the United States, that agree with Roy Moore. While most do not, there is a hardcore constituency that believes what he believes.
As someone who knows Alabama politics, do you think he's going to win? Because, you know, polls say it's close, but, you know, it seems like there's probably maybe, just as we saw in the national election, a lot of people who may not say they're going to vote for Roy Moore, but will. Do you think he'll win?
Well, I mean, what we're seeing on the ground here is similar to what you're seeing in New York and D.C. He's moving ahead in the polls. You know, when we speak to people privately, there's strong support for Roy Moore. So I would not be surprised. I would be surprised if Doug Jones won. I wouldn't be surprised if Roy Moore won.
Do you think any of these, I mean, if you look at poll numbers purely, it seems like since these allegations by the number of women have come forward, his numbers have gone down. You know, you said you still think he's going to win, but it's closer probably than it would ordinarily be for a Democratic candidate in the state of Alabama. Do you think these allegations have hurt him, or do you think it's kind of hardened his support among his hardcore base supporters?
Well, when we talk to Republicans throughout the state, there are many Republicans that are just going to stay home. They're not going to vote for Roy Moore, and they're not going to vote for Doug Jones. And these are private decisions. They're not going to come out and say that openly. But that's the way the Republicans that we've talked to feel. However, there's, a constituency that doesn't trust the media, doesn't trust these reports, and they're going to vote for Roy Moore.
It's interesting. So you're hearing, and again, people not making a big deal of it, but from Republicans who just sort of decided to sit this one out.
Absolutely. I mean, not everybody in the Republican Party is a Roy Moore fan, not even here in Alabama. I mean, Judge Moore has always been a more fringe candidate in that he rejects modernity. He rejects the society that he sees around him, and it threatens him, and it threatens a lot of people. And that's what we hear. I mean, I dare not speak for Roy Moore or anybody else, but from what we hear from people, you know, they do agree with him on some social issues. But the vast majority, I think, of Republicans, you know, they find some of this reprehensible. I mean, the statements.
Yeah.
You know.
Bill Britt, I appreciate your expertise on Alabama politics, and we'll see what happens. We'll continue to check in with you. Wish you the best. Thank you. Again, if you want to see my entire interview with Janet Porter, you can find it at ac360.com. Coming up next, previously undisclosed emails revealed today from Donald Trump Jr. The deal with that now infamous Trump Tower meeting with Russians. And the California wildfires, more homes burned. The winds fueling the fire only getting stronger tonight. More ahead.
The Steven Universe podcast is all about Steven's dream with writers Ben Levin and Matt Burnett.
So much of it is figured out at board because it's, so much of it needs to be visually presented, and, you're not going to try and describe shots to the board artists, and it's all a conversation in the room and a collaboration between everyone to kind of make that moment feel the way you want it to feel.
So join me, Mackenzie Atwood, for a new episode of the Steven Universe podcast at Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Breaking news tonight in the Russia probe. Previously undisclosed emails show follow-up after the Trump Tower meeting in June 2016. Follow-up that Donald Trump Jr. said never happened. CNN Jim Sciutto joins us now with more details. So what do these emails show?
Well, Anderson, these emails contradict what has been the Trump campaign and now administration storyline about this meeting since it broke. One, that it was a one-off, and two, that the subject of the meeting was entirely about Russian adoptions. These emails contradict that. I'll give you an example. One email on June 14th, 2016, 5 days after that Trump Tower meeting, between the man who set up that meeting and one of the Russians who was there. This happens to be, I should say, the day that news broke that Russia had hacked DNC emails. So in one of these emails, the man who brokered this meeting forwards a CNN story about the Russian breach of DNC emails to two of the Russians involved in this meeting and says, "Isn't this eerily weird?" And I'm quoting there, in light of what we talked about 5 days earlier. Now, that's interesting on a number of levels. One, there was follow-up between participants in that meeting. Two, it also raises hard questions about what the subject of the meeting actually was, what came up. Because we know leading up to the meeting, there was talk of the Russians providing dirt on Hillary Clinton. Now you have email traffic after the meeting that seems to reference exactly that.
This isn't email traffic, though, between Goldston and Donald Trump Jr., correct?
No, Rob Goldston, I should identify him as a British publicist who helped broker the meeting. It's between him and one of the Russians who was in that room, a gentleman named Ike Kavlazadeh, and also Emin Agalarov, who was another one of the Russians who helped broker the meeting. It's not between him and Donald Trump Jr., but it's discussing what was discussed in that meeting where Donald Trump Jr. was among those present there, including Paul Manafort, Jared Kushner as well.
There is a separate email that mentions something about Russia's version of Facebook, right?
That's right. Numerous emails, actually, again, between Rob Goldston, the publicist who helped broker the Trump Tower meeting, and Dan Scavino, who at the time was with the Trump campaign. He's now the social media director for the Trump White House. And in this, in this series of emails, I should say, Rob Goldston is pitching him, saying that we should really get a page for Donald Trump Sr., the candidate, on VK, which is Russia's Facebook, in effect. And we're also told that that idea came out in part from that meeting in Trump Tower. So, the significance of it is not clear. We know that congressional investigators are looking into it. But again, it raises those questions. One, there was clearly follow-up to the Trump Tower meeting, and it raises questions about what was the actual subject of discussion when all those parties were sitting down in Trump Tower. Yeah. Congressional investigators looking into it. They're sure to be asking Rob Goldston about it when he is questioned before those committees as soon as next week.
Jim Sciutto, appreciate it.
Thanks
very much. Joining me now is CNN senior legal analyst and former U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara, who President Trump fired less than 3 months into his presidency. Not a smoking gun or anything, but again, another piece of the puzzle. It's also a reminder that we've only really seen the tip of the iceberg, just in terms of emails around the Donald Trump Jr. meeting. We've only seen the emails that Donald Trump Jr. decided to put online under pressure.
Yeah, no, I think that's correct. I think the point that you were making is a fair one. We don't know that there was a conversation between, this publicist and Donald Trump Jr., although it is the case that the story keeps changing. There are other dimensions to the story over time. But, the fact that we're continuing to hear about information coming out of the investigation a little bit at a time, week after week, means, and I think this is a good thing, that we don't have any idea the scope of what Robert Mueller is looking at, the scope of what he has in his possession, and the scope of what he's going to have in the future.
Because even in those emails that Donald Trump Jr. did release, it seemed to indicate Donald Trump Jr. wanted a phone conversation with one of the Aglarovs prior to having this meeting, and even sent him his telephone number. Unclear whether that phone call ever took place, but theoretically, that could be something that Mueller would have access to as well.
Yeah, I think so. And, it points up to the issue of making sure in any kind of investigation, if you're potentially a target, to get the story right and get the story put out in its full and proper way in the first instance. So if it now turns out, after Donald Trump Jr. has, I believe, said, there was no follow-up, I didn't do anything with the follow-up after that meeting because I thought it was useless, and then it turns out that there's email traffic or texting traffic between him and other people with respect to a follow-up, that doesn't help him.
During yesterday's hearing on Capitol Hill behind closed doors, Donald Trump Jr. Said that he could not discuss conversations he had with his father, that they were he was claiming attorney-client privilege because there were attorneys in the room. Have you ever heard of attorney-client privilege being extended to just because there were attorneys in the room?
You know, it depends on the circumstance, but as a general matter, there's no attorney-client privilege between there's no father and son privilege. There's an attorney-client privilege, and sometimes it's the case if there's a joint defense agreement between and among multiple people, for example, at a company, and there was a privileged conversation between the lawyer and those other non-lawyers in connection with the provision of advice. I guess that's possible, but my understanding is he's invoking something far more broad than that. And there's an attorney-client privilege, there's a preacher-penitent privilege, there's a spousal privilege, there's a doctor-patient privilege, but there's no such thing as a father-son privilege.
If two people are talking just in front of a priest, you can't claim pendant privilege.
Look, there have been cases, and this has been litigated for a long time, because sometimes people, in order to shield their conversations, will plop a lawyer in the corner like a potted plant to try to give the aura of there being an attorney-client privilege issue there. The parties have to work that out, and the investigators have to work that out. But simply by having a person who has a law degree sitting at a table while two other people are having a conversation, the mobsters